Okay, good morning, or afternoon, I suppose, where you are, to my logic class, week 16, and it looks like snow again. So, here we are. So I hope you didn't have any trouble on your homework. If you do have problems or questions, please email me. With logic, everything is building on the previous concepts, so I don't want you to get lost. You need to, keep up with it. Okay, so you've been introduced to the terms antecedents and consequence before, and ante, as I mentioned, ante means before, so antebellum means before the war. And you see here a lovely dress of someone who is in an antebellum costume before the war. Before the Civil War. So ante meaning before, an antecedent comes before the then part of a statement, of an if-then statement, hypothetical. And consequent sounds like consequence, and it comes after the then part. It follows by implication. P implies that Q will happen. Okay? So, the modus operandi is the mode of operation, or the way things are done. So when the modus operandi is invalid, is what we're going to be talking about next. When people are doing modus ponens or modus tollens, sometimes they make these mistakes, or they don't hear that they're wrong. They sound like a modus tollens, or it sounds like a modus ponens. But you have to watch out for these. These are the two big things that we're going to be studying this week that are invalid forms. So when you see them, no, not valid, okay? The first mistake is denying the antecedent. So denying what comes before the then. So in modus tollens, the proper form, you would deny or negate the Q. But it's an error to, in the second line, negate the P. In the if P then Q. If you say not P, you're denying the antecedent, what comes before the then. And that's invalid. Because if P then Q, if P is true, it implies Q. Doesn't tell you anything about if P is false. So that's, we're not going to do that. Denying the antecedent is one error. Affirming the consequent is another error. In modus ponens, you have if P then Q, P. You're affirming the P. Therefore Q. But if you affirm the Q in the second line, then you are also creating an invalid form. So we're going to take a close look at that. All right. Denying the antecedent. Don't want to do that. This mistake often occurs in an attempt to do modus tollens because we know MT, modus tollens, uses the not symbol. Here's an example. If I study hard, then I will pass the exam. I didn't study hard, therefore I won't pass the exam. That sounds right. And the tricky thing is that sometimes these invalid forms of logic will sound right. That's why you have to test them by rules. And for the rules we're learning about today are denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. So, why is this wrong? It sounds so right. Take a look at it. Okay, it's a logical fallacy because not studying hard doesn't necessarily mean you'll fail. There could be other ways to pass the exam. You might be naturally gifted at the subject, have prior knowledge, or the exam might be easier than you expected. Maybe you were listening in class and really understood what the teacher was saying, and therefore she asked the questions on the test that were things you were paying attention to. So studying hard may not be necessary to pass. Of course, in my class it is, right? No, just kidding. All right. So it's invalid reasoning, and I mentioned this before, because the initial conditional statement, the condition, if P then Q, only tells us what happens when the P is true, when the antecedent is true. It doesn't tell us anything about what happens when it is false. See? Okay, the other mistake is affirming the consequent. Here's an example. If it's raining, the streets are wet. The streets are wet, therefore it must be raining. This is a logical fallacy, because while rain does cause wet streets, other things can cause wet streets too, like a street cleaner, burst of the water main, or someone washing their car. Or kids playing with a hose. Okay. Now sometimes the use of negation is confusing, because we learn with Modus, Tollens, the if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And so we're thinking, when you see negations, you're thinking of the form, but a negation can just be a part of a term. So let's take a look at this. If Moses did not obey God, then he would not enter the promised land. He did not obey God, therefore he did not enter the promised land. Now, before I go on to explain this more, I want to just mention that when we were talking about categorical syllogisms, you couldn't have two negative premises. That applies to categorical syllogisms with all or none or some, okay? When we are talking about modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, the not would be part of the term. It's not a universal statement, okay? So it's a whole different animal. So don't worry about that. Don't worry about there being 2 or 3 negative lines in this particular kind of form. So it can be confusing if you get hung up on the not, okay? So look at the first if-then statement. It's a negative statement. And I used, instead of using variables, I used constants here. The O was for obeying. The E was for entering. So if he did not obey, then he would not enter. And so the second line, notice I put a period after the not E. The second line, if it were done in the 3-line normal format, would be not O. So he did not obey God. So that's a not O. Therefore, not E. But now, look at what we have here. The very first section, if Moses did not obey God, then he would not enter the promised land. Not obeying is the antecedent. It's what comes before the then. Not entering comes after the then. So I am saying the not O is true. The antecedent, I'm affirming that that's what happened. Okay? So if he did not obey, then he would not enter. I'm affirming the first part. Okay, that happened. He did not obey God. Remember when he struck the rock twice? And that was like, all right, this is seriously bad now. Okay, you're not going to get to enter the promised land. So he did not obey God in that instance, and all the people basically saw their leader disobeying God, and it looked like he got away with it because all the water rushed out. In any case, so instead of getting hung up on the negation symbol with this, what you need to look at is the actual form. And this is why it's helpful to replace constants with the if P then Q for all of these, for the modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism. They all start with if antecedent, then consequent. So in the second line, depending on if it's a modus ponens or a modus tollens, it will either affirm the P is true, therefore the Q is true, or it will negate the Q, say, well, Q's not true, so P's not true either, okay? And those are valid. So this is a modus ponens. Take a look at what I wrote here under the if not O, then not E. Not O is the antecedent. Not E is the consequent. If P, then Q. The not O, the P part, is true. I affirm the antecedent, so the consequent must be true. It follows. It logically follows. This pattern is modus ponens. So don't let the negation puzzle you. Just look at, if you're thinking it might be modus tollens, the second line would have to negate the antecedent, okay? If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. If you see that pattern where it's negating it, then negating the Q, then you know you have a modus tollens. So what would happen if Moses did obey God? We would start out with, if Moses did not obey God, then he would not enter the promised land. To negate this, to turn it into a modus tollens, we would look at the second part, the Q, okay, which in this case would be not E. And the not E would not only go before the conclusion, it would be the second line, but it would be not E. It would be a double negation, because if you have not and you want to switch the value of it, you have to say not. It's not. Therefore he did not enter the promised land if he had been obedient. So if we change this to a modus tollens with its current form, I know this seems puzzling, but just stick with me. Are you affirming or negating what is said here? If Moses did not obey God, then he would not enter the promised land. If that's our if P, then Q, and we're going to make it a modus tollens, then take the consequent, and you'd have to negate the consequent as it's written. Therefore, he did not enter the promised land. Or you could just say, he did enter the promised land, but there wouldn't be a therefore because it's not the conclusion of this. Modus tollens, we take the Q, put on the second line. He did enter the promised land, so not equals a positive, right? He did enter the promised land. Therefore, we must conclude that he did obey God. Okay, so that would be a double negation, which equals a positive. Two negatives make a positive. All right. Negation can be confusing. Look at what the statement is, and if you're affirming the statement, or like it's the opposite. Okay? The clue, big clue, this is the main thing. Look at where then is. Now the if-then symbol is, we don't see, when we have if P then Q, we don't see anything before the P, but the if-then symbol stands for the if and the then. The Q represents the then part. So look for where the then is, what comes after this horseshoe on its side. Is the first term affirmed and the second concluded? It's a modus ponens. If P then Q, P. Therefore Q. The more you work with these patterns, the easier they get to recognize. Just trying to help you avoid simple mistakes. Okay, a term can be complex. Now the first one I showed you, because it had the nots added, that added some complexity to it. A single term can have a negation as we saw before, or other phrases added, and still qualify as a modus ponens or another valid form. This is why you need to memorize the variable form, so you can hear it, hear the patterns. If antecedent, then consequent. Antecedent, therefore consequent, modus ponens. Now I gave you a sheet, was it last week or the week before, with 9 different valid forms of reasoning using variables and symbols, symbolic logic. I want you guys to become familiar with those. It might be a good idea to just, like, once a week, just take that sheet and copy it. Modus tollens, modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, and then there'd be other ones. There's 9 of them altogether that you need to learn the formats of. And they'll be explained. The next 3 I will start explaining next week. So, here's an example. If I do the laundry and clean my room, then I can go to the mall and see a movie. Notice the extra things are added there. I have some ands. It's still if P then Q. The antecedent and the consequent are complex. I'll show you in the next slide how to handle that. Oh, okay, the next slide after this. I'm going to look at modus tollens first. Now, I have changed the P and Q to specific letters, which means specific phrases, okay? If H, then A, not A, therefore not H. So notice what I have negated here. I've negated the consequent, and therefore I have concluded the negation of the antecedent. This is a modus tollens, it's valid. If I ask for my classmate's help too often, that's the antecedent, then she will get annoyed with me. She is not annoyed with me, so I must not be asking for help too often. That's an example of a modus tollens. All right. Now I'm going to show you a hypothetical syllogism, and you can see the form up here. If P then Q, if Q then R, therefore if P then R. If P leads to Q and Q necessarily leads to R, then P will necessarily lead to R. Here we go. Going to complicate it. If Goldie jumps in the lake and her coat is not washed and dried, then she will stink. Oh, this is true of dogs. If Goldie stinks, then my mom will not let her in bed. Therefore, if Goldie jumps in the lake and her coat is not washed and dried, then my mom will not let her in bed. Sometimes in normal English we leave off the then, but we know it's there. We understand it's there. It's the consequence. It's the result of what comes before. Okay, but you see the extra words in here, the ands and the nots? Let's take a look at the form. Here's Goldie. Oh my goodness, I hope I haven't left out a slide. All right. If Goldie jumps in the lake and her coat is not washed and dried, then she will stink. If Goldie stinks, then my mom will not let her in bed. Therefore, Goldie jumps in the lake and her coat is not washed and dried. If Goldie jumps in the lake and her coat is not washed and dried, then my mom will not let her in bed. And you see here how I've taken it in the antecedent, and I have put specific phrases and changed them for capital letters, which means it stands for something. The J here, I've decided if Goldie jumps in the lake will be a capital J for jumps. And then I've got the and symbol, and her coat is not washed and dried. Those both have to be done for her to be allowed to get in mom's bed. So I put the washed and dried in a parenthesis showing they go together, but the not symbol in front of it. So if she's not both washed and dried, and sometimes the parentheses will stand for both, okay? So, if Goldie jumps in the lake and not both washed and dried happens, then she will stink. So the W is for her being washed, the D is for her being dried, and the after the if-then part symbol is S is just for she will stink. So then we take, oh, you notice there's, besides the parentheses, because washed and dried both have to happen together. Around that whole antecedent, which is very complicated, there's a lot of things said there, but it all comes before the then. So just like in algebra, if there was a complex problem with a lot of different things being added, subtracted, multiplied, divided, whatever, you would use parentheses, and then outside the parentheses, for the bigger part of the statement, you'd use brackets to show it. And you might even have another set of brackets if it gets, to show that this is the part of the problem and what you do first, that sort of thing. So in math, you use brackets to separate terms. And the same thing in logic. This is going to make it easier for you to see everything in this outer bracket is the antecedent. Everything. All of that is before the then part. So antecedent is J and not both W and D. Okay, all of that is antecedent. All right, then consequent is just S. All right, because this is a hypothetical syllogism, if P then Q, and then if Q then R, the consequent of the first line becomes the antecedent of the next line. S, if S, then not B. If she stinks, then she's not getting in bed with Mom. Okay. So, in a hypothetical syllogism, then, because we've concluded that all this leads to not B, we are summarizing it in the therefore. So, the first antecedent will lead through logical thinking, the process, it will eventually lead to her not being able to get in bed with Mom. So, that's the story of if P then Q, if Q then R, therefore, if P then R. Don't get confused because I said then R and there's a not B there. Because whatever the antecedent is, it's going to be representative of what was said. If antecedent 1, then consequent. Okay. If antecedent, then consequent. If this consequent, then it leads to, if this consequent becomes the antecedent of another if-then we have a new consequent. If P then Q, if Q then R. So it's a logical progression. This will lead to that will lead to something else, and so the first thing will lead to the final thing. I hope that's understandable. I do not want you to be confused by negations. Just look at ka-chunk, ka-chunk, okay? Take the complicated ideas and think in your mind, this is an antecedent, this is a consequent. This leads to this leads to this, therefore the first thing will lead to the second consequent. That is a hypothetical syllogism. And it can get complicated. Now in your homework, I don't know if I could show your homework up here. Anyway, in your homework, let me turn this off and turn on camera. Robert, this bigger? There we go. Ooh, it worked. Okay. So, your homework, logic homework, I have here an explanation of everything I have gone through with you in the slides, and there are a few more examples to help you understand it. And then your first exercise is going to be show which of the following examples are modus ponens, which are modus tollens, denying the antecedent or affirming the consequent. So you'll abbreviate this. Modus ponens will be MP, modus tollens MT, denying the antecedent DA, affirming the consequent AC. So all you need to do to check if you're doing it right is, look, that's blurry. Look at your homework. On page 1, it'll show you what I just taught you about. So let's take a look at, and there's 2 pages of this. So all you have to do is put in what type it is. Is it if P then Q, P therefore Q? It's modus ponens. Is it if P then Q, not Q therefore not P? Modus tollens. If it's denying the, denying the antecedent, denying the P part in the second line, then that's a mistake. That's DA for denying the antecedent. If it's affirming the consequent, like if P then Q, Q, that's affirming the consequent, then that's wrong. You don't even need to see the third line in those, and you'll know it's just wrong. Okay, so there's 2 pages of that. That's exercise A in your homework. All right, then complex terms we go over. So yes, I do explain on my handout more thoroughly what I went through in complex terms with the hypothetical syllogism. Hopefully super understandable. I try. And then you are going to go through the next 2 pages, which are exercise B, and discern the valid forms from the complex arguments. So these will be complex arguments, and there are no errors in the second exercise. They're all good, they're all valid. So you have to decide if it's modus ponens, modus tollens, or hypothetical syllogism. And hypothetical syllogism is real easy to find because there's 3 different full if-thens. Modus ponens and modus tollens. There's one tricky one, number 9 here. And I put a little note, look at what's being denied. Okay. So I talked to you about double negation, and a not is the same thing as a positive. So if you are negating a negation, that's the same thing as making a positive statement. So if you have a negated term, if a negated term, then a negated term in the first line, then look at the second line. If you have a positive statement in the second line, then you've got a double negation somewhere. And if you have said P is not true, well, that would be an error. If you said Q is not true, and it was like if not P, then not Q. Not Q. That's a double negation. So you have denied the truth of what was said. And denying the consequent is, oh, sorry. Yeah. You aren't going to find errors in this one. So, alright, let me go over that particular one, because that may confuse you. So let's look at it. So this is exercise B, week 16, number 9. Let's just go over this one. If Cain repented and did the right thing, then he would not have killed his brother. But he did kill his brother. So Cain did not repent and do the right thing. So what we have here is we've got if P then Q, and Q, the Q part of the first line is he would not have killed his brother. So that's the consequent, right? That's the Q. But he did kill his brother. So he did not kill his brother, right? I have done a not Q. So what form is that? If P then Q, not Q. Even though it says, but he did kill his brother, I'm denying the consequent of the first line, denying the Q. It's a not Q. He did not kill his brother. So this is what you have to look for, and not be confused by negations. Look at what's being denied in the second line. He did kill his brother, so it's the Q is not true. So Cain did not repent and do the right thing. And so because it's not Q, then it's not P. And you know which form that is. All right. So 10 is very wordy, and of course these are complex terms. So what you want to do is change them over to first line would be if P then Q, if antecedent then consequent, and then see what happens next. Okay, you could put parentheses around the whole term before the then. Put a little P over it. Okay, and then after the then, put parentheses around the whole term and put a little Q. And then see what happens in the next line. Okay, and you can see if it's Modus Ponens, Modus Tollens, Hypothetical Syllogism. Hypothetical Syllogism is if P then Q, if Q then R, therefore if P then R. Okay, and the final page of your homework is review. Complete the square of opposition. So I want all of it there, and you have from previous papers, previous handouts, you have how to do that. And this is just to keep you sharp on it. We will be reviewing everything we learn this semester periodically. So, and there will be. No, we're not going to have a test next week. We're not going to have a quiz next week. Nope. But we are going to start introducing the other concepts on that handout I gave you. The next 3 of your valid forms we're going to go over. So, I hope I made it more clear and not less clear. I know this is clear. So, if you want extra help with anything, just let me know. Or extra explanations, let me know. All right, I'm going to, for those of you in debate, I'm going to just be sending instruction in an email, and I would like you to respond to that, because we were going to have a discussion this week. We'll have to do it through email, because I want to pick teams so we can get started. Okay? So have a good week. Enjoy the snow. And no cupcakes today. Next time we get together, there will be cupcakes. Okay? Take care. And those of you that are sick, I hope you feel better. Okay. Bye for now.